As the axial age was the assemblage point of all the world culture, so the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali were the assemblage point of all the yogas which existed before. The question of what exactly the sage Patanjali had written is, as always, difficult one. The thing is that in classical religious Indian tradition there are at least 3 treatises which are prescribed to the sage Patanjali. As a matter of fact, the Yoga Sutras, known to us, the Mahabhasha treatise on Ashtadhyayi Panini, which is an explanation of Sanskrit grammar, and there also was a sage Patanjali who wrote the Ayurvedic treatise. So in a classical Indian tradition it's considered to be just one single person, the heavenly sage Patanjali, who is even canonized, and it's moreover than he is canonized. This depiction is not the depiction of a snake, but is a depiction of Patanjali. There is a South Indian temple near Pune which is dedicated to the sage Patanjali, who is considered to be the embodiment of the cosmic snake Shesha. And the very name Patanjali is that he was born Pata, fallen, and Anjali, palms, so just he fall down into his mother's palms. Surely it's some later mythologizing. But what are the sources of such mythologizing and canonization? Surely it's admitting the huge role of this personality. For a long time in India, Patanjali was considered to be just one person, but now in modern science it's almost proven that these are 3 separate persons. So there were the Patanjali the grammarian, Patanjali the Ayurvedic master, and Patanjali the author of the Yoga Sutras. And we are firstly interested in the author of Yoga Sutras. Patanjali himself called his treatise Anushasanam in the first line of Yoga Sutras. After the lines dedicated to Ganesha, the first line says Atha Yoga Anushasanam. Here is the explanation of yoga. Anushasanam is the further explanation. Anu means further, after, and root shas means to explain. So Anushasanam are usually called the treatises which summarize everything available. And in this sense we might presume that Patanjali had summarized lots of texts in schools which even didn't reach our days. But we must admit that lots of texts have reached our days thanks to gathering information from Buddhist schools, Hindu schools, Jain schools, and so on. Even 50 years ago we couldn't understand that deeply of what happened 2500 years from now. And now that period is studied quite deeply. Nevertheless, it's considered that in this very treatise Patanjali had summarized everything available by his time. But speaking frankly, he not only gathered the existing ideas. Many ideas were developed by him. They also existed in some preliminary state, but by his work they became more understandable and more clear and more complex. And first of all, Patanjali had given the new definition of yoga. Yogash chitta vritti nirodhaha. I even hadn't translated it from Sanskrit because it's truly impossible. So what is meant here? Do you remember that in Kathopanishad there was a metaphor of city with 9 gates, through which prana flows out of the practitioner, while in Bhagavad Gita there was a metaphor that the practitioner has to control indriyas and manas. Like the turtle pulls its paws inside itself, so the yoga practitioner should pull the indriyas inside himself and commit the pratyahara. What is called pratyahara in yoga? The opposite pulling into oneself. In some texts, the thing which flows out of the practitioner is called manas. But Patanjali now talks neither about prana nor about manas. He introduces the new category, chitta, which now actually has some new nuances. In fact, chitta is derived from the root chit, to think. So chitta is something like thought. But English word thought doesn't give the right meaning. I try to explain what is chitta in my blog, and the easiest explanation is the substantialized matter of thought. For instance, I'm thinking of what happens in my house, then my chitta is there. Or I'm thinking about the future, then my chitta is there. But if I am here, then my chitta is here. Chitta essentially is in the place of my self-awareness. And nirodha is more or less understandable word. It means control, holding, and so on. So here we remember the chariot metaphor of controlling the horses, the metaphor of the turtle, which controls its paws. But we might say that the word vritti is the conceptual finding of Patanjali. Just note, in previous treatises, like Kathopanishad, what could the organs of senses be linked to? Only to external objects, while the category vritti is the broader one. In one of the next lines, Patanjali enumerates 5 kinds of vritti. Pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, smriti. For example, smriti, the remembering. If we remember some material object, it truly is the way citta to this object. In case of nidra, we dream of the future, and it's also the way to external object. But how in this perspective could we explain the pramana, viparya and vikalpa? In fact, vikalpa is staying citta inside the hollow core category. So essentially we are reaching the new level of abstraction in understanding. In other words, if we are using words which we don't understand in their meaning, if we are operating with images which we cannot really define, this also holds our citta. And not only the obvious material objects. For example, I'm thinking about the cup, so my citta is there. Now, when I'm thinking incorrectly about some philosophical category, then my citta is there. If I'm using the wrong conception, the misconception, the viparyaya, then my citta is also there. But even in case of pramana, the first vritti, if I'm thinking correctly about everything, even then my citta is restrained, because even every right knowledge has its own limits. Maybe later we would know more and we would expand these limits. In this case, the explanation of yoga as citta vritti nirodha is not another anushasanam and just another explanation, but is something new. It's an ultimately new step in abstraction of understanding of yoga. Further discussion of Yoga Sutra should be started from the misconceptions and not from the main ideas. Because from one side, Yoga Sutra is the fundamental treatise upon which all the modern schools are based. And on the other side, while almost no one actually reads Yoga Sutra, then it's the source of misconceptions, of one's own misconceptions, which are prescribed to Patanjali. So what are the most common misconceptions prescribed to Yoga Sutra? At first, Patanjali talks about the Ashta Anga, so-called 8 steps. In fact, Anga is not a step. Anga is the part. For example, Angula is the finger, a part of the body. Anga Sharira, the parts of the body. So these are not the steps, because the steps are hierarchic, while the parts of yoga are not. 8 angas of yoga are 8 principally different ways of spiritual development. And in no way the sequentially given yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. But if you will take any article on the Wikipedia, you will see this absolutely absurd thought. And further, Patanjali explicitly explains the samadhi category. But again, you Google samadhi and you receive thousands of articles saying that samadhi is the goal of yoga. And there is no single line in Patanjali Yoga Sutra saying that samadhi is the goal of yoga. Moreover, the whole 3rd chapter is dedicated to the results which could be gained when committing samadhi on different objects. And we have some extra further goals, then samadhi is not the goal by itself. Moreover, the samadhi is not the state of trance. And again, samadhi is not hysterics, it's not stem stroke, it's not a cataleptic situation. If we are considering naive understanding of yoga, then we come to one of these thoughts. But in fact, to understand the word samadhi, we must understand first its etymology and then to understand how it was used by the Patanjali himself. The morphology of the word samadhi is the following. The prefix sam means holding together, the prefix a is a strengthening prefix, the root dha means to localize something, and e is the suffix. So if we would now decrypt this word, the closest meaning would be like the gathering. When something has gathered together, like you gathered your thoughts, you haven't understood something and now you understand it. In other words, samadhi is some intellectual experience. And then, to understand the semantic saturation of any system, one has to commit the frequency analysis of the words used in it. Our instructors had made a frequency analysis of words in Yoga Sutra and had found out the following thing. The most widespread root in Yoga Sutra is the root jna, to know. Yoga of Patanjali is the pure intellectual system. It's a very complex epistemology. It's a very complex theory of controlling the creative forces, and in no way the system for falling into some physiological state of trance. So samadhi is some kind of intellectual enlightenment. In terms of Western psychology, is the situation of Gestalt completion. Actually, there are about 20 widespread delusions. I would not discuss all of them. And the next one is the following. I assume that you know some basics of yoga. And the categories yama and niyama are usually treated as the ethical steps of yoga. So these are not ethical stages. The root yam in the word yama as well, and in the base of the word niyama. Ni is only the strengthening prefix, so the root yama means to control. In fact, the name of the god of death, the yama, is derived from this very root. Yama is the death, and the death is the controller. Only taking death into account we can derive on some serious decisions. Only death is the ultimate frightening factor, and the world could be controlled. And essentially, yama and niyama are the degrees of inner control. Asteya, aparigraha, brahmacharya, satya, ahimsa are the levels of yama which defines Patanjali. So we understand that all these levels are the levels of controlling corresponding energies. Asteya is the state of non-embezzlement, so it's the control of Muladhara energies. Brahmacharya is the control of sexual energies. Ahimsa is the control of Manipura energies, the destructive ones. The aparigraha, the non-restraint to the household, is the control of Anahata energy. And at last Satya, the truthfulness, is the control of Vishuddha energies. In the same way, niyama could be also linked to the control of different kinds of energies, but it's the separate lecture. So it's not a question of ethics, but the question of inner structure of psyche. And then there are illiterate references to Yoga Sutra as the source of description of body practice. And Yoga Sutra doesn't describe the practice of asanas. Only 4 lines of Yoga Sutras are dedicated to what we call Hatha Yoga. 4 of 186. One line says that gathering chitta is available by holding the breath. Another line defines the notion of asana as sthira sukham asanam, which means steady and pleasant posture. Another 2 lines describe the essence of asana practice, and one talks about the essence of pranayamas. So it's actually 5 lines in total. And that's it. All the rest is dedicated to cognition and meditative processes, the creative processes, the process of attention control. So apparently the Hatha Yoga already existed in Patanjali's period, but its place was pretty modest in Patanjali's system, only 5 lines out of 186. So what are the key new ideas introduced by Patanjali? Well, this is not the whole list. I have the greater list in my blog on Patanjali Yoga Sutra. There are around 20 new ideas enumerated. And I intend to expand this article because I found even more of them. But if we would just briefly overlook them, then we could state the following. I already explained one of these new ideas about the category vritti, which left the material world and went to some more abstract conditions. Secondly, the psychological nature of karma. The thing is that before Patanjali, karma was accepted as something external and objective. Like there is some kind of inevitable force which forces you, motivates you, and so on. And Patanjali was the first to say that roots of karma are samskaras, the inner, the self-motivation of the person. The karma is defined not by the external, but by the internal, by our own desires. To exemplify this, there is an old parable about one old Brahman and his spouse, who decided to commit the ritual suicide by starving to death, because they couldn't live anymore. But while the husband has passed away quietly, the wife has felt the smell of fish in the last moment, and she desired to eat some fish, and in the next life he was born a king and she, the fisherman, because all of her existence desired fish, and the next incarnation was defined by this desire. But even if we will not consider the transition among the incarnations and we would stick to some more feasible things, we can see that our own life events are defined by our ousted desires and not with some external factors. Essentially, our own hidden motives and desires lead us to their realization. And this is karma. Therefore, the ability to work with karma is defined by the ability to work with one's own psyche, using self-awareness techniques, getting rid of some external desires, and so on. All the latter methodology of working with karma, both in Tibetan yoga and in modern yoga, is based on this very thought first formulated by Patanjali. The next thought is even deeper. By its scale, it surpasses everything said before. It's clear that if karma is defined by the emotions, the raga, the vesha, and so on, then to control oneself, one has to control his emotions. But how can one control his emotions? If we consider some naive psychological schools, they may suggest methods like if you want to be happy, just be happy. And if you want to be merry, then just be merry. Don't be ignorant, don't fall into despair, and so on. How come could this be done? Actually, it's impossible to be done, because emotions cannot be controlled by other emotions. Emotions are controlled through awareness, through a higher cognitive function. For example, someone has told you something unpleasant. You expressed aggression to him in return. It doesn't matter how much you say to yourself that he's a good man, that it's no point to show aggression to him. It wouldn't work out in a long-term perspective. It would rather be an extrusion in the way of psychoanalysis. But if you would understand for what purpose, for what reason did he say this unpleasant thing? For example, something unpleasant had happened to him. Or he's angry at you for something else and you just don't know for what exactly. Only then your attitude to this situation would change dramatically. So to change emotions, one has to change the understanding of the situation. And here Patanjali introduces the concept of asamprajnata, which is almost literally transferred as awareness. So if we understand the situation in some larger context, if we view the situation from some higher perspective, only then could we change the emotions in this situation. To my mind, it's brilliant and it surpasses the understanding of most modern psychological schools. Of course, the naive psychological schools who try to work with emotions by the emotions. The next question is, what is the goal of yoga according to Patanjali? As I said, it's not samadhi, and the fourth chapter of Yoga Sutra of Patanjali is called Kaivalya Pada, or the chapter about Kaivalya. So here Patanjali introduces the new category, which, if we think deeper, was already in Kathopanishad and Bhagavad Gita, but it wasn't so beautifully named. So what is Kaivalya? Kaivalya is an abstract noun which is derived from the adjective kevalam, and kevalam means to be in solitude. But it's no state of depression, it's the state of being lonely or alone, with no negative connotations. So it's like a positive loneliness, the detachment. In a great fiction book, The Black Troublemaker on Indian Mythology by Henry Lyon Oldie, there was a personage called Parashurama, the Rama with the axe. Shiva had gifted him this axe, and Shiva said to Parashurama, "While this axe will be with you, then nobody's will influences your decisions, even my own. You are the only one to make your decisions and you are the only responsible for them." In fact, for a usual person, it's normal that his decisions are brought from outside, with his own desires, with his habits and dynamic stereotypes, by other people, with the advertisement and so on. So while others influence us, that's not we who live, that's not we who make the decision, although we are totally responsible for them. And in Kaivalya experience, the person withdraws all the influential external factors and makes the decisions according to his own inner nature. In the third chapter of Bhagavad Gita, there is a similar line, but on the level of abstraction it hadn't reached the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. There is said that if someone had reached the state of wholeness, then he doesn't want anything from other people, and his decisions are defined only by himself, and doesn't want anything that he doesn't give the responsibility to other people. And similar idea is in Kathopanishad. If you have found your deeper self inside the cave of your heart, then it defines your actions and your decisions. Not the emotions, not the desires, not Indriyas, not some crazy horses. It is you who make the decision, the master of the chariot. The dhira makes the decisions, or what is later is called drashtar by Patanjali, the spectator. As you remember, the first line of Patanjali is yogaschitta vritti nirodha, and the next two lines are brilliant. Tada drashtuhu swarupe avasthanam. That means that in the state of chitta vritti nirodha, the drashtar, the inner self, the spectator, is in its own nature, and in the other time he is dissolved in his vrittis. Vritti sarupyam itaratra. So it's not you exist in a chariot, it's you are the horses. But when you are the owner of the chariot, then you decide where to go. You are the master of your own life, and this is the goal of yoga, and not some abstract moksha, the dissolution, the flight in the rainbow shining. This is a very feasible and realistic goal. It somewhat resembles the ideals of Stoicism and with some other Greek schools, but nevertheless this is the idea. And further, Patanjali was brilliant to describe the stages of cognition process. The last three angas, namely dharana, dhyana and samadhi, he gathered in a general process named samyama. The root is yam, to control. But what is the essence of samyama experience? To learn anything, you must first of all reach the state of dharana. Dhara from root dhr, to hold. Dharana is holding. holding your attention on the object. That's what the ancient yogis talked about. You can think about what you decided to think, but not about what your emotions bring you. So the first stage is that you have to learn how to concentrate. The second stage is dhyana, from root dhyai, to think. But there are about 10 roots in Sanskrit which mean different aspects of thinking. So dhyai is the correct thinking. In contrast, for example, to root man, which means to have some conception. Dhyana at the process starts when the man doesn't have to push himself harder. He doesn't have to hold himself on the thinking process. The object of thinking is interesting in the way that he cannot think of anything else. And only after that one can reach the samadhi. That's when the different aspects of the problem you were thinking about will gather all together and you will see the whole problem in its completeness. Brilliant, isn't it? I think there is nothing more brilliant in the whole psychology of creativity. Further, Patanjali had given an exact definition of each anga of yoga. What is pratyahara, what is dharana, what is dhyana, what is samadhi? Patanjali also introduced lots of new ideas, but I think that's enough for now. We must admit that Yoga Sutra is not only the one of most famous texts, but it also is one of the most commented ones. Lots of classic commentaries to Yoga Sutra are known. I enumerated 6 commentaries here, but the most famous of them is the Yoga Bhashya of Vyasa. Yoga Bhashya was written about 500 to 1000 years after the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, and exact datings are not well known. It's a pretty explicit commentary. When Yoga Sutra is only of 186 shlokas, the Yoga Bhashya is a whole book. So this is the most famous and the most quoted commentary. But I think that Vyasa introduced lots of changes, at least in commentaries, to the text of Yoga Sutras. For instance, in one of the sutras he added the word samadhi, but there was nothing like this in Yoga Sutra. The essence of Yoga Sutra in Vyasa's commentary had shifted to some less thinking, less intellectual practice. This usual translation as yoga as restraining mind stuff, yoga's chitta vritti nirodha, which in my opinion is totally meaningless. Because Drashtar is part of consciousness and has to deal with mind, and he's in his own natural form, so why did the consciousness has stopped? But this motive of not thinking was firstly introduced by Vyasa about the stopping the actions of mind. And further, Vyasa was in his turn commented by the very famous philosopher Vachaspati Mishra. He was a great classic of Sankhya, he wrote Ishvara Karika, some several treatises in Sankhya, and he made a huge extensive commentary to Yoga Bhashya, the Tatra Vaishravadi. And what is interesting for us in Tatra Vaishravadi? It is the first to mention asanas in detail, so some basic set of about 20 asanas appeared in that period, and it evolved in a more detailed description in the commentary of Shankara, not the Shankaracharya. But there is also a detailed list of 20 or 30 asanas. And here is the photo of my collection of classical commentaries to Yoga Sutras. So it's a whole shelf and not all of it is here. For instance, these 2 yellow volumes is the Shankara's commentary. And these 4 volumes is the Vijnanabhishu's commentary of the 17th century. And this big yellow book is the first volume of Vyasa's commentary. So here we see about 20 classical commentaries. And if we consider the commentaries in English,